Good day to you. Normally I would start out our class today by stating that radio news has been on the decline in the last few years, but it's circumstances like the coronavirus that always bring radio news roaring back. Most radio news, as you might suspect, is listened to in the vehicle. And so what do we have going on right now? We have an international pandemic where people are seeking to get the quickest information that they can. And if they happen to be in a vehicle, as many people are, you don't have the opportunity to go on your phone. You can't stare at your smartphone while you're driving. And so what do? We rely on radio to let us know what the latest death count is in the US, when the country might be reopened, and what coronavirus is like, etc. And so radio news has these cycles, and that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about radio news. And yes, because of other technologies, radio news has been on the decline overall in its overall trajectory in the last 30 years. That's because people get news from Yahoo and Twitter and even Snapchat. You get news from all kinds of places today, and you don't need to have the four traditional media as your only choices: radio, TV, newspapers, and magazines. So radio news generally has been on the decline. But radio news is used differently from other kinds of news. It's used because it's used as breaking news. We often rely on radio to tell us this is the first time we're hearing about it. It's the first time that we're hearing that the coronavirus has had this many deaths in New York City. That's where we're getting it from first in radio. And a lot of people turn to radio just to get that first impression. And then they're going to dig deeper. If they found out some information that they're interested in, Kobe Bryant has gone down to hell, now they're going to go onto the web and they're going to research that. They're going to talk to people on their phones. But radio news often breaks news. Radio news has a very important place in the history of radio. It actually was the very first broadcast, was a radio newscast in 1920, right here in Pennsylvania, in the western end of the state, KDKA radio station in Pittsburgh. It was known as the very first radio station, and its very first broadcast was a presidential election. The Warren Harding and Cox was the person's last name, I forget his first name, that election in 1920. The company Westinghouse took a transmitter, which was just in the early stages of development, a piece of equipment, and put it on the highest building in the city and started broadcasting, and that's how you get KDKA, which is still broadcasting today. Later on, newspapers, which used to own radio stations, they perceived that radio news was a threat to their audience. Yeah, you've got a newspaper owning a radio station, just like you have Google owning YouTube. At what point do they start to grab each other's audiences? That's what newspapers were worried about, and so they actually tried to put a bunch of restrictions on radio news. You can read about that in the book when you read this chapter. Those restrictions included saying, hey, radio people, you're not going to be allowed to announce live news. You're not going to be able to cover international news. You're not going to be able to announce news before we print it first in the newspaper, because you're going to steal our audiences. And radio stations basically said, the hell with that. We're not doing that. You're not going to give us the news from your division of newspapers so that we can announce it on the air. We're going to develop our own news. We're going to have our own news teams. CBS News was one of the first to do that. And in so doing, they also developed a style of journalism called broadcast news. It's a whole style of writing which you'll learn about if you take the class CMST 229, Broadcast Journalism. It's offered in the fall. It's a class that will teach you the lexicon or the grammar of writing news. Very simply put, if you were to read in a newspaper that concert tickets are $100, you would see that listed as the number sign, right? And then 1, and then 0, and then 0, okay? That's how you'd see it in a newspaper. But notice when you read that aloud, you're actually having to unscramble those words to say them in the right order, even though you do it naturally and don't think about it. So you actually say $100, even though the dollar sign comes before the 1. We don't ever want to do that in broadcast journalism because we don't want to cause the announcer to have to hesitate to think, especially when they're announcing news, because then the audience is going to say, does this person really know the news? And now the believability of the news has been threatened. Radio news reached its peak in World War II. There was no internet, right? Television wasn't around yet, so radio news was it. People were glued to their radio receivers, especially because the U.S. got involved in the war, and you had our young soldiers in Europe, and people back home were dying to hear about news without having to wait till the next day for the newspaper to come out, so radio news really took off. Today, radio news actually is very vibrant in big cities. The most popular stations in terms of audience size and scope, the biggest audiences, are news stations in big cities, like KYW in Philadelphia, for example, or WCBS in New York City. And then there's also a second all-news station, WINS. These are all news radio stations. They're not doing music, they're doing news. And that's because when you have the density of a city, you have a lot of people driving in, and there's a lot going on with all those people, and concert events and sporting events and political events and crime. Yeah, that's why radio news is so unpopular. Let's talk about radio news in today's environment. Today, radio news is mostly done in the morning drive, between 6 to 10 a.m. when people are going into work. You can also find some radio news done in 4 to 7 in the afternoon, which is known as afternoon drive. Most stations do some kind of news. If you're going to be a more music-oriented station, your news is going to be more entertainment-oriented. That's what disc jockeys are designed to do. They're designed to be talking about celebrities, sports figures, and pop culture. That's the kind of news that you're going to get on music stations, whereas on more serious stations, you get hard news. Even the Poconos 96.7, where my dear colleague Elisa, before she passed away, was a news director, she was doing serious news, and it's a music station. News is usually found on the AM band, by the way, in radio. And that's because the AM signal travels so much farther than an FM signal because it bounces. It can bounce over mountains. It's not as good quality, but you don't really need good quality. You don't need good fidelity for the listening of news, not like you would for music. So music tends to be more on FM, and radio news tends to be more on AM. Now let's go to the main position who handles news at a radio station. That would be the news director. The news director is responsible for developing and implementing the news. And as such, they work very closely with the program director of a radio station, who oversees the overall content of a radio station. And your news director's job is to get a lot of local news on there. That's what ensures the survival of radio in the news arena, is to make sure you're carrying school lunch menus and traffic closings and local municipal meetings and crime that's happened in the area. That's what you're doing in radio news. You're keeping it local. You're letting the really big networks, radio networks like CBS, Fox, you're letting them do the national news because you don't have the resources to send your reporter to even to New York City if you're a local radio station. So now let's go to what makes a news person. What makes a person a good news person today? You got to have a college degree, and you have to have a degree that is in a liberal art. A liberal art, like communication, a liberal art is all those fields that have to do with non-technical services like nursing or hospitality management, and also have to do with all those fields that are not scientific. So the liberal arts are those fields like history and philosophy and communication and English. And the reason for that is because the liberal arts degree trains you to be a critical thinker, trains you to be able to find that information, sort through whether it's trustworthy or not, sift through it and make sure that it matches up with other information, confirming it, synthesize it, analyze it, interpret it, and then come to your own conclusions. That's what a liberal arts thinker does. So you have to know things, right? You have to know, who are your senators right now from Pennsylvania? Can you name our federal senators? Do you know that Bob Casey is a senator? He's a Democrat. Do you know Pat Toomey is a Republican? He's our second senator. Do you know that kind of information? Yeah, you got to know it if you're going to be a news person. So you have a liberal arts degree for the most part. You also have to have experience. And that's why at ESU we have our students who are in broadcast journalism and also voice for broadcasting, the follow-up course in the spring. That's why they are announcing WESS news briefs as part of that class to give them that regular practice. That's why we have an internship program here so that students can go out if they are interested in news, they can get some experience in the context of an internship. That's why in my radio talk show I have a live field correspondent. It used to be Helen Bradley this semester before the coronavirus hit. I've seen so many students come out of our station and go on to work in the news industry. We have Anya Whitehead right now, who's a reporter for WBRE in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. And we have scores of people across the nation who have come out of our tiny little program here in news. If you're interested in news, let me know, because I want to help you achieve your dreams. It also takes, among those kind of competencies that you gain in college, it takes some other skills to be a news person. For example, you have to be assertive. You can't be really a mild-mannered person when you're going out and trying to get an interview with somebody who might be a suspect or a politician who doesn't want to answer your questions correctly. They want to tell you what their campaign platform is. So you have to be really, really assertive to get to what it is that you're trying to find. You need to have energy, right? You can't be this person, oh, I'm too tired right now, I can't get up in the morning. When I was writing my doctoral dissertation, which is that big document you write for your Ph.D., my study was actually on how radio news is gathered using technology. And I went to all kinds of radio stations to observe them at 2 o'clock in the morning, in some cases, or 6 o'clock, because that's when people are getting the news ready for the day. And I was at KDKA at 2 o'clock in the morning in Pittsburgh when a multiple alarm fire broke out, and the person I was shadowing just said, "Come on." And I ran after him. We ran down the hallway, got in the elevator, got in the company car, and went out to the site. And there was a burning townhouse, and the owner was standing there with his dog, watching his whole life burn down. And the reporter was faced with the difficult question of asking that person whether they were going to ask them for some kind of a soundbite. And the reporter in that particular situation said, "No, this person is suffering too much. I'm not going to talk to them." You might have made a different call. I don't know. That's up to you. But you need to have that energy. I'm tired. I can't go. No, you got to spring into action. You also have to have an innate, that means natural, or developed inquisitiveness. You have to be very curious about things. You need to be asking questions all the time. It's sort of that child who you give an answer and they say why, and they keep saying why. That's what you need to be as a professor. And you also need to be very knowledgeable of your geographic area. A radio station has a signal radius that's terrestrial. That means coming from their over the air broadcast. And they also have their webcast or their streaming news service, of course, as well. But most radio stories that are news stories are going to have to do with wherever people live within that signal radius. So you got to know the local businesses. You got to know the local political officials. You got to know the roads for how to get there. You just have to be really knowledgeable of your geographic area. You also have to be a performer as a radio news person. You need to be not just a good writer, but you need to be a good deliverer of news, a good announcer. That's why we have a class like Voice for Broadcasting, which I'm teaching right now, which helps develop those skills. Now, when it comes to preparing a news story, let's talk about that next. You've got to have excellent proofreading skills. Let me tell you, one typo, especially with a person's name, and you've just reported a person who's in a car accident who's not that person, right? Because you mispronounced their name and named somebody else. Now you have a whole lot of angst on the part of family members. So typos matter. They affect your speech. Same with punctuation, awkward phrasing. That's why we have broadcast journalism. You want to be fluid while you're on the air because you want to be believable and you want to make your story interesting.